Welcome to part one of our webinar series, The Pedagogy of the New Normal, brought to you by the Division of Professional Education, UP High School in Iloilo at the University of the Philippines, Visayas.
Ma'am Sol?
Maayong hapon sa tanan. Thank you, good Sir Mark, for coordinating with us no, para matigayon ang webinar. We are really very excited nga dayon na ini ang webinar nga ni. Thank you, Ged. Maayong hapon sa inyo da.
And Ma'am Sol, ikaw na lang gayon introduce kay Sir Donnie.
Right. I will stand in as moderator for this afternoon's activity. And our main speaker for this afternoon is none other than our resident PNN expert, Professor Donnie Jones Sadusta. Sir Donnie?
Thank you very much, Ma'am Sol. Maayong hapon sa tanan. Mabuhay. Nasadyahan kita ko actually nga mag-session for PNN or Pedagogy of the New Normal. Kay may excuse ako nga maghambal in Hiligay nun. Kagkaraya. Nagakaubusan ako di sa hapon nga language. Anyway, maayong hapon sa tanan. As they say it here, tajahao. Anyway, so this afternoon we'll be talking about and discussing about the pedagogy of the new normal. I have seen your expectations and some of our challenges, and hopefully, we could not really answer all of them this afternoon. However, hopefully this could be a start of a very fruitful conversation that will guide us through this new normal. I'll be sharing my screen now so that I can start my presentation. Okay, here we go. So this afternoon, we'll be talking about the pedagogy of the new normal. And in order to do that, we have to reflect on the educational and pedagogical assumptions and approaches and assessment schemes before the enhanced community quarantine, because that's when we started to realize about the new normal. Second, we need to articulate our personal or professional thoughts and practices that one thinks need to stop, start, continue, or we need to tweak given our current collective experience. So we as teachers, our personal selves and our professional selves sometimes are not easily distinguished. So we must be able to address that as well. Next, we're going to explore the current or emerging educational and pedagogical assumptions, approaches, and assessment schemes after the ECQ, which is actually now. It's the new normal now. So for the last month, more than 100 days, we have experienced COVID-19 and its effect, both internationally and, of course, locally. So cases around the world has been increasing nonstop. And just yesterday, the Philippines recorded a total number of 32,000 active cases, which brings our total to around 46,000. And it is not a good condition. It's not a good place for us. And quite importantly as well, it has a toll on our economic condition. It says that the longer the pandemic progresses, the lower the income pay of a lot of people. So a lot of these changes and a lot of these issues will affect mostly the poor, and especially in countries that are already poor to begin with. Okay. So especially in the Philippines, we are always given a lot of anecdotal experiences about how difficult it is for our poor fellow Filipinos to get through all of these challenges. And true enough, according to Oxfam is an international British charity organization. They estimate that it's going to be in East Asia and in the Pacific whose people will actually become poorer and poorer as the pandemic progresses. So also, one of the effects of the pandemic is that a lot of the children and women sometimes who are staying in abusive households have to stay with their abusers, and that's another condition that the United Nations is looking at. However, a lot of this is we're trying to address that, and because of that, we're trying to do physical distancing. And physical distancing is a new social arrangement that we have right now. Let me just share to you some of the things that we did in Taiwan. You see, Taiwan is one of the few places in the world where schools were still open. So, for example, some of our high school students, they created their own cleaning robot for the highway, for the school passageways. So some elementary students made a robot that would sprinkle hand sanitizers for their classmates so that there would be no hand contact. So these are just some of the things that these are the new social arrangements. So you have to wash your hands all the time. You have to disinfect all the time. And if you eat anywhere in Taiwan, especially during the height of the pandemic, you would have dividers. So even in class, students would have to have these dividers in their classrooms. Here in our university, because I'm studying not in Taipei, I'm studying in a university far away from Taipei. It's 3 hours from Taipei. We have also tried to prepare for an online learning scenario. Of course, it did not happen, but we wanted to be prepared, so we prepared it way in advance. So right now, there's of course temperature check everywhere. One of the approaches that has been recommended, not only here in our university, but also in hospitals, is what we call as psychoneuroimmunity, where we get our strength of spirit from other people. However, because the prevention strategies of this kind of approach entails that we have to always be in contact with people, and wearing masks sometimes prevents us from doing that, to be accessible to people. So it prevents us from expressing compassion and friendliness because we are open, uh, putting something on our face. However, we also have to accept that this pandemic, whether we are directly affected or not, will cause a lot of psychological distress, not only to students, but even to teachers and even the frontliners. Studies here conducted in Taiwan and in mainland China said that people who may not be even directly affected could still suffer from what we call as vicarious traumatization. So, biskan wala ikaw naapektuhan personally, but seeing other people getting affected could also put some trauma on you. But and which means that it could have certain manifestations like PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorders, and different people have different ways of coping to this kind of situation. And that is why when we want to plan for the new normal, when we plan for the new normal, we must always put disasters as part of the equation. We could never assume that it's going to be smooth sailing from now on, especially for our students. When during the start of the pandemic, we have seen how there had been more than 8 million students around the world who had been displaced, and it only increased to more than 1 billion uh, uh, at the end of March and even now. However, this also spurred some of the modalities, because a lot of people believe that okay, the pandemic may be here, but education should not stop, and that is why there has been an acceleration in digital educational materials in the market right now. And because of that, there has been a sudden shift to online learning as if it's the only option. And right now, we are glad that in the Philippines, we recognize that the online learning is not the only option. There could be other modalities of learning for us. But during the initial start of the pandemic, it was online, which was the most popular. And so I asked, for example, some of my friends who are taking a PhD in economics here in our university. By the way, that's our social science building in our university. And I asked them, so what's going to be the most potent or growing industries because of the COVID-19? And they said that e-learning and alternatives to e-learning will still be one of the top industries post-COVID and during COVID. And for instance, uh, here in Taiwan, they see that yes, Taiwan can do that because when the pandemic struck, Taiwan was one of the few places on earth where schools are still open. And of course, universities are prepared for online learning. And because here in Taiwan, they believe that internet is a basic human right. So, which means that the government assures or would like to assure that here in Taiwan, everyone has access to affordable internet or even free access to internet as part of their democratic right as citizens. Because here in Taiwan, they believe that people can participate well in democracy if they have internet. Because with internet, there is information, and with internet, there is voice. So you're able to get the services of the of the government and the services of the state because if you have internet. And that is why they even have what they call as a digital minister here in Taiwan. But the issue of the internet is not very clear or sometimes very romanticized. For example, let me share to you briefly, very fast, some of our experience when we did a research in the Huadong region in Taiwan. Huadong region is a rural region in Taiwan, and we studied technology-assisted grade 4 English classes in Huadong region. So Huadong region actually is a region where uh, a lot of rural schools, a lot of poor students, and this is where most of our indigenous peoples of Taiwan are living in. And most indigenous peoples, of course, are poor here in Taiwan. But so they're trying to put the technology in. So what did we learn when we studied technology integration here? This, by the way, this is before COVID-19. So what we learned was that the digital divide is also a social divide, especially in rural areas. It doesn't mean that even for progressive countries like Taiwan, internet is still a social problem, which means that if you're poor, there's no internet for you or little access to internet, even in public schools. Next, you could not just drop a technology in schools or for teachers or for students and expect it to work. The technology must be harmonized with sound pedagogy. So it's not enough that you just drop a technology and expect it to work. It must be integrated with proper pedagogical and instructional design. Next, teachers, learners, and technology share different relationships. So for learners, technology is for them to get excited about. For teachers, technology is something that they could use to engage learners. For learners, what we have discovered in our research that uh, they use technology for them to go on voyages or do exploration. And for teachers, they use it to make their work procedural. For learners, they want to use technology to leverage their experiences, and for teachers, they use it to gather evidence of learning. So technology is not very simple. It's not very straightforward. Depending on who uses it, how they are using it, it presents certain opportunities and also a lot of problems, even for progressive countries like Taiwan. And what the COVID-19 pandemic shift to online learning has taught us that we are prone to what we call as panic goji. And what is this panic goji? In our attempt to make everything feel normal or make every educational system feel normal once again or back to business, we have shifted to online learning to mitigate that. And because of that, educators and students felt overwhelmed and unsupported to do teaching and learning online in such an abrupt shift. So it wasn't very easy. The shift was not very easy. And until right now, a lot of us are still doing panic goji. We are not anymore thinking clearly as long as we are trying to roll out all of these modalities and technologies. And because of that, and because of this panic goji, we can see right now how our educational technology and equity and access issues become more and more obvious. We can see those who have no access and with those who have no access. And we could always say that the modality is always there. So, but the thing is that no one has foreseen this. Let me just share to you one book that I'm reading right now. It's called Academia Next, where the author Brian Alexander predicted that in the future there's going to be a pandemic that will disturb educational systems, and it sure did. And the thing is that there are three possible forecasts for what was going to happen. Things that first forecast, it will go away eventually by September because schools in the United States start at September. Also here in Taiwan, our schools start during September. And second forecast is that perhaps during the fall or after fall semester, we're going to do remote classes, and after that, back to normal, or it will not be back to normal. We are going to have what we call as the toggle term, where there's going to be intermittent disturbances of pandemics that we could not stop. So the thing is that we are still doing the panic goji amidst all of this planning. And especially in the Philippines, it's going to be a big issue because we have one of the slowest internet connections in the Philippines. I guess this webinar is already an illustration about that phenomenon. And when we want to force ourselves, our teachers or our students to go back to face interaction in our classrooms, we have to also face the consequences of them getting infected, just like in the ones in Britain, for example, just like in this news, or this one in France, and this one again in Britain. So these are very real risks that we are putting our learners and also us teachers. So when we insist on face-to-face interactions, that is why we have to recognize that during the new normal, there will be more and more disruptions to human activities. There will be a shift on attitudes, on social goals. Before, we want to get honors or we want to get, let's say, awards. Right now, the important thing really is survival or not getting sick. So the second is that the third is that the socioeconomic gaps that were there before in regular school, in the old normal, are still here, are much more pronounced in the new normal. And there's going to be some incongruence between old assumptions and approaches, which we'll be discussing later. And there's going to be a new social interaction patterns, more physical distancing, more hand washing, more temperature check, more health declaration forms to be filled up. There's going to be a lot of these things that will become normal. And of course, the more that we have to acknowledge that we have diverse and different contexts for our learners. Unlike when we put them in one classroom, we can control the context at some point. But now that they are in their own homes or in their own communities, the context becomes even more powerful in as a factor on how we design learning materials for our students. So of course, we could never expect our students to go back to the old normal. And also we could never expect teachers such as ourselves to go back to the old normal. We have to think of the old normal and rethink the demands of the old normal. So we could never pretend that we can still comply with the demands of the old normal because it's just going to give us a lot of frustrations, a lot of danger, and a lot of uncertainties. That is why we as teachers, as students, and as schools, we have to abandon the old normal. Well, not perhaps instantly, but gradually. So we have to rethink about how we love the old normal and how we should be able to engage and uh, live in the new normal now. That is why we, with the University of the Philippines in the Visayas team, we propose the pedagogy of the new normal. And just a disclaimer, this is not a magic pill that will cure everything for all of us. In fact, this is just the start. So what is this pedagogy of the new normal? This is what we call as a proposed tentative analytical framework. So what is this framework all about? What will this framework do? So when we use this framework, for example, we use this framework today, we start using this framework today, this will be able to help us how to think of, talk about, and plan for the education in the new normal. A lot of our planning or a lot of the things that we did before was just basically for panic goji. And that is the reason why it wasn't very profound or very fundamental in its approach. So it has three parts. First, we have assumptions, approaches, and assessment. Please allow me to walk you through some of the components of all of these parts. So the first part, these are the assumptions, the approaches, and the assessment. So for the assumptions, we have the purpose of education and pedagogy. So next, teacher's role, nature of learners, what is valued in school. For the approaches, we have the nature of teaching, the nature of learning, the context and spaces of teaching and learning, the tools and resources. And for the assessment part, we look at assessment tools and resources, assessment methods and strategies, assessment parameters and standards for quality, and next is goals and values of assessment. Now, you might wonder, where did we get the this framework? So what we did was that we tested out this framework and we gave them to a group of educators. I think sa March pa. So it's an evolving framework. So what did we get out of our initial responses? So just like you were given these tables. We also gave these tables to some of our friends and some educators or also researchers. So ginasira ni nila. So what did our initial responses to the framework gathered so far as we compare the old normal and the new normal? So we gave this to a group of educators and researchers, and these are their responses. So, for example, in terms of uh, the old normal, the purpose of education in the old normal was to produce human capital or human resources for economic development. That's why we call lifelong learners. And but in the new normal, however, the according to the responses is going to be to nurture learning human beings with empathy, resilience, self-mastery, autonomy, and sense of purpose. Because of the experience, because of the collective experience of this pandemic, we tend to now shift our expectation about what is the purpose of education. So right now, it's not anymore about competitive economic standards. It's going to be more about how do we nurture more community, more compassion, more resilience. Next, what is the role of the teachers? Before, we are the facilitators of competencies and we are the collectors of assessment outcomes. Si ma'am kag si sir ang manog-collect sa exam results, ang manog-check sang exam, kag manog-collect sa mga outputs ng students. But now, in the new normal, it's going to be different. The role of the teachers in the new normal would have to be proactive, empathic supporters of flexible and creative learning spaces. So, how will that happen? We'll try to look at that in the next part on the segment, on the approaches segment. What will happen to our learners? Before, we see our learners as potential human resources who has to be trained towards certain competencies. But now, uh, the pedagogy of the new normal says that our learners have to be taught of, we have to see that our learners thrive in context and they are active, they can make decisions, they can collaborate, they can make sense, and they can learn and act based on urgent and relevant conditions. And they are capable, and when given immediate feedback. And what is the thing that should be important in school? Before, what is important in school are scores or grades or awards. But now, uh, and we do that by, for example, reaching a certain standard through examinations. And that is how we gain what we call as cultural capital. But in the new normal, um, a lot of the responses says that no, what is going to be most important in schools now would be that schools should be able to teach us self-regulation and autonomy. It must be able to teach us creativity, innovation, to work well with each other, to adapt to changes, to solve problems. Because we are now in a global collective problem and we must be able to help solve that problem in our own contexts. So, to summarize, the assumptions of the new normal pedagogy could be summed up in three concepts: autonomy, growth, and collaboration, which is not only expected among learners, it is also expected among teachers who would have to be more autonomous with our work. We have to be growth oriented about how we are going to imagine ourselves, and we have to work in collaboration with each other. So that is for assumptions. Let's now go to our approaches. So, for our approaches, in terms of the nature of learning, in the old normal, we just deliver a sequence series of topics, and that's it, and just gather outcomes. But in the new normal, we would have to engage in active and collaborative teaching of relevant content and skills. Again, the key word there is relevant, that leads to meaningful action and changes in personal and social life. The mere fact, perhaps, that the Department of Education released what we call as MELCs, or most essential learning competencies means that there are certain competencies that are really, really more important than other competencies. Next, we have the nature of learning. So before, our learners were learning was just to produce outcomes that conform to standards, to central standards set to us by central office. But now, in the new normal, according to our responses, they say that it's going to be self-selected, self-paced, self-assessed, social authentic experiences. Meaning, it's going to happen in the context, in the and it's going to be assessed by the learners and the teachers and other people as well. So it's going to be open and flexible. And where will it happen? In the old normal, of course, it will happen in our classrooms. It's going to happen in our schools and sometimes in online platforms. But in the new normal, it's going to be any place, anytime, as long as there are resources, as long as they are guided, and as long as they are given feedback. That's why we teachers, even if it is remote learning or online learning or distance learning, we are still important because it is us who would have to give the feedback, still to guide our learners. In terms of tools, of course, we had printed and visual materials before, we had online materials, but we were using them differently before. But now it's going to be a different way, maybe perhaps the same materials, but different way of using these materials. So before, it was just mostly printed, but now it's context source. That is why if you're teaching science or teaching mathematics, there's now what we call as informal science and informal mathematics. We call it the science ng totoong buhay and math ng totoong buhay, because it turns out, according to research, that meaningful learning about mathematics and science are achieved when it is complemented or supplemented by informal learning about these concepts. And perhaps we could also explore ICT based, as like what we are doing currently this afternoon. And also, we have to do what anything that is from our community could be a source of learning as well. It could be materials for learning. So people in our community could be resources for learning. The common, let's say, community garden could be a source of learning. The brook or the stream could be a source of learning or lessons as well. And just a brief reminder, I think a lot of us are very aware of this already, is that since we're already in a very stressful environment, let's have some caution when we want to push our learners. Because again, the reminder is Maslow before Bloom, context before content. So before we push our learners to learn new content or new skills or new approaches, let us first try to check if they are ready, if their uh, if their Maslow's basic needs are met. And of course, when we have learners, they do not come to us without any baggages. So we must be able to um, address some of these issues, especially the economic issues. For instance, there would be an issue like, yes, we can do online learning and we could have modules, but will the quality of learning of the student with the module and with the access to online resources be the same? Will the quality be the same? Okay. And that is why we, as teachers or schools or communities, uh, we must ask ourselves: Are we able or support? Are we able to support these new learning modalities? Are students capable of using learning in these new modalities? Because, for example, when you drop a technology to our learners, we could never assume that they will be able to use it instantly. They have to learn how to use that. Also, we have to ask, are our schools and teachers given enough support or creativity or independence in terms of implementing the new modalities? Perhaps it's easier for some private schools, but in some schools, especially the public schools, they have certain rules. But perhaps in your case, you could explore uh, places and spaces where you could have some creativity and independence that you can integrate in how you design. And when we design with the learner in mind. A lot of us, for example, in the old school, just like me, we were educated in the old normal approach where we design based on what is easy for the teacher. But now, more than ever, we must be designing based on what is convenient for our learners. the thing that the design should be able should be more personal to them, gives them a sense of agency. Agency here means that they're able to do what they want to do. They're able to do inquiry. They're able to collaborate. These designs should be able to make use of their authentic spaces around them, and they must be able to change some of their old outputs and make it better. They must have some productive struggle, because if tasks are easier, students also get bored. And of course, to facilitate self-regulation, there must be some goals and accountability, and there should be some models for them to rely on. And it must be able to allow them to do reflection about what now. Okay, I've already gone through this experience. What do I do now? So these are just some helpful reminders when we want to design. And I think in the next webinar series, these are the things that we'll be talking about more in detail, especially on how to imagine this for different subject areas. So for assessment, which is actually one of the things na naga-shortcut kita permi, like when we try to migrate on our courses and our lessons online, ang first gig nga pamangkot, di paano ko maghatag sa test? So, wala pa gani nato na think ang entire system, ang test ang ginapanumdum naton. So, in terms of assessment tools, in the old normal, of course, standardized test is the gold standard. But now in the new normal, maybe, but not the gold standard anymore, because in the new normal, any means that could capture the learner's creativity and innovation and resourcefulness is going to be the assessment tool that we're going to use. Before, it was paper and pen assessment or performance state-based tasks, which is good. But in the new normal, we say yes, we will use the old normal methods, plus we will make use of more authentic and content-relevant experience and ways of knowing. So when we are in the community and we are not learning within the confines of the school, the context becomes different. Next, our parameters, assessment parameters and standards of quality. Before, standardization and standardized assessment is the way to go. So we have passing scores, ranks, adherence to academic content and tradition. So these are the gold standard of assessment before. But now, what is the gold standard? Relevance, engagement, collaboration, flexibility, context sensitivity. So which means that it's going to be quite different than the fixed standards we have had before. So just a heads up, it's going to be evolving. So chances are people will still be debating about the gold standard about assessment, even now in the new normal, because it's difficult to let go of old normal ideas about uh, parameters and standards of quality. So it's okay. Sometimes, perhaps in the new normal, we will still have the old parameters, but we will have to have new additions that will be more reflective of the needs of the current times. And before, the goal of assessment was to assess learning, which means that it emphasizes accuracy, correct answer. There's always one correct answer. Consistency. So for example, our skills should be marketable. It must be able to help us go through college or make us pass examination so that we can go to college, get scholarships, or get good grades and get good jobs. So it's for competence and excellence. And usually it's called assessment of learning. We are not saying that assessment of learning is bad, but we are saying that it's the incomplete picture of learning. So in the new normal, aside from assessment of learning, we must also emphasize assessment as learning and assessment for learning. So what does this mean? It means that we have to design an assessment so that students would have to regulate their own learning, so that they will not just depend on the teacher. So the teacher is not the police or the uh, a warden trying to make sure that they don't cheat. Students themselves would have to regulate themselves. And also, this kind of assessment will help inform us, teachers and administrators, about, are we creating spaces where students can assess themselves, and can the assessment reflect their authentic learning? And the same as that, how could we structure our learning spaces so that our learners can learn better or can learn more. So that is the difference between assessment as learning and assessment for learning versus assessment of learning. Because in assessment as learning and assessment for learning, we, teachers and administrators, learn from the products of assessment on how to design better learning environments and how we could encourage students to look at themselves more critically and assess their own learning. So, to summarize, what we have to do is a more balanced uh, treatment of formative and summative approaches to teaching and learning assessments. So before, the teacher has complete control. But now, because our students are far away from us because of remote distance education or online education, how are we going to assess in such a way that the responsibility of assessment would have to be on the student, and the student would have to make decisions, would have to make really wise decisions about how they assess themselves. So before we have high stakes testing, and now we have low stakes testing. But it's the key takeaway of here is that if it is student assessment and the students are more engaged in assessing themselves, they become more authentic. They become more uh, true to themselves, and they are sharing responsibility with us teachers as to how they assess themselves. I'm sure if you ask Sir Jesse, Mam Sol, or Mam Genevieve before, they have tried some schemes before where students try to critique each other's work, or they try to critique their own work. And sometimes they could be very, very sharp in their criticism on themselves and on their classmate compared to sometimes how we would have to uh, critique their work. And I think that is already an indication that yes, our students can do uh, uh, autocorrect on themselves if they are given that kind of space to do that. And so to end or to summarize the result of our pedagogy of the new normal, for the assumptions is for the pedagogy of the new normal, as we have gathered so far from our friends and our educators and other researchers, that we have to move towards more autonomy, more growth, and collaboration. So students can collaborate even if they're far away. Teachers can collaborate whether we're far away, but the important thing as well is that it encourages autonomy and growth for us, for us teachers. And for the approaches, let's not think of what is easy for teachers. Let us first think of what is easy for our learners, or what is convenient for our learners. There is, I think, some confusion between convenient for learners and appropriate for learners. And that is where our knowledge of the learning styles of our learners, our knowledge of the context of our learners will inform us teachers about which tools or approaches should we use when we design learning activities for our students and learning modality as well for our students. And in terms of assessment, we are saying that yes, assessment of learning is important, but also important, especially now, is assessment as learning, where learners, when doing assessment or while engaging in assessment, can do self regulation and can critically evaluate themselves. And of course, assessment for learning, for that is for us teachers. So when we do assessment, will the products of assessment help us give feedback on how we could create better learning spaces for our students? So it should be an entire picture of assessment: assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. So that is the total picture of the general roadmap for the pedagogy of the new normal that we are offering. But this is again a conversation. This is an ongoing conversation. Later on, we're going to be asking you your opinions about this so that we can put it into the existing framework. And the framework will have to evolve. And we have to offer that framework again to another set of teachers who would have to look at your work and assess whether that is the kind of future, the new normal future of pedagogy that we want to pursue. I think Sir Jesse has pointed it out before. The new normal will not happen to us. We will have to make the new normal happen. Let's not wait for it to happen. Let's make it happen. And I think that's it. Madam, give salamat, and I'm looking forward to your questions and our interactions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Donnie. Salamat good for that comprehensive talk and sharing on the various approaches, assumptions, approaches, and assessment um, during the new normal na points of view sa magkalatabo sinay na new normal na i-close lang ini siya ni Sir Donnie by highlighting important issues. So, Sir Donnie, Sir Don, naka-mute pa ikaw, sir.
Again, I'm happy and I'm very proud of our participants this afternoon. Very engaged in sa ila, and I'm really happy with their very practical suggestions as well. Because as much as we want to be very ambitious, we have to work within our resources and within our means, man. But it does not stop us from wanting to get more, especially for the sake of our students. So just to sum it all up, for assumptions, for approaches, and for assessment, we always have to think about moving forward. Hindi na pagbalikan ang samuna. Uh, Things will change eventually. It's gradual, but it's going to change. It's already here and it's long overdue. Kung balikan natin ang mga assumptions, approaches, and assessments, dugay na ni sila actually for the last 10 years. Subong ta lang na-realize nga mas kinahanglan na siya gali subong. So it's already here and it's long overdue and it's about time that we engage in them. And that is and some priorities that we have to consider. First, Maslow before Bloom, not only for our learners but also for us teachers. So we could not take care of the needs of our learners if our needs are not also taken care of. So we have to ask: am I anxious? If is my anxiety crippling me from delivering care and compassion to my learners? Because as teachers, we could not teach compassion and other values if we are lacking in it in ourselves. So before we push them to do Bloom's taxonomy, let's make sure that Maslow is first addressed. Next, equitability before accountability. Before tasukton ang aton nga mga learners or before tasukton ang aton nga mga teachers, before tasukton ang aton nga stakeholders, we must make sure that they are given the resources in order to provide whatever we are asking for them. Next, pedagogy before technology. Just like our application now, hindi talang pwede idagdag ang technology and expect it to work. We have to orient ourselves and orient the users on how the technology works and how to make it work well. Next, persons before processes, which means that unahon anay ang dignity kag ang capacity sang person before ta i-insist nga dapat amuni ang process kay i-follow ninyo. So remember, we are first persons. We first must care for the person, and the soul and the dignity of the person is paramount to us. Next, learning before schooling, which means that even if they don't go to Calvario School, to Calvario Memorial School, they can still learn. It is dependent on the kind of resources and the kind of context that we could work well with as designers of learning. And that is why I just would like to point out that when we say teaching, traditional teaching usually is that we teachers are providers of input, but non-traditional teaching or the more contemporary teaching is that we are designers of learning. So think as a designer, not as someone who is just giving inputs. So designer thinking kita dapat. So we think like a designer. We anticipate the need before it even happens. So that is why even if we're going to do online teaching, never ever uh, forget compassion, because all of us, including teachers, may ginapagdaanan kita tanan. So I know it's difficult, and therefore I will give more leeway to my learners and to my colleagues, especially because we are going to be working together with each other. That's why here, may ginaliwat-liwat ni diri perming statement diri sa communities, especially when I work with rural schools here in Huadong region in Taiwan. They say, uh, 输人不输阵在干面. It means that to lose as an individual is acceptable, but to lose as a community becomes a shame. Ululupod kita dapat tanan. This is a Taiwanese proverb here among local Taiwanese. Of course, kita sa Philippines may ara man. We have our bayanihan concept. And if we thresh out the bayanihan concept, it means that we have to make it public. So even if we are working as an element, as a school, as Calvario Memorial School, we must make sure that our concerns and our efforts are also public. In that way, people will know what you're doing. People can give inputs, and it's open for the public. And there must be free flow of feedback among teachers, among members of the school. Just like in any bayanihan, kung mag-carry, magbitbit na sang balay, there must be growth and achievement for all, not just for the teachers, not just for the learners, but also for the school itself, which means that the school will have to evolve as an instructional system. The instructional system that you have had perhaps 5 or 7 years ago would have to have changed by now. Next, egalitarian spaces and mechanisms. According to innovation studies here in Taiwan, by the way, Taiwan is one of the top five in innovations around the world in the last innovation index released 2 months ago. In isa sa mga reasons for that is they have what we call as egalitarian spaces and mechanisms. Instead of having uh, a more vertical system, they have a more horizontal system. So, just like in Bayanihan, we have a more egalitarian space. And next, we have collective consensus on the vision, which means that everyone understands nga dira kita kapakadto, and all of us are committed to have or to proceed to that direction. So that's the Bayanihan concept in terms of innovation, of Filipino innovation. So we could use that as our metaphor for the way forward. And just a way forward, as a reminder, when planning, never revert to autopilot. Ano na siyang autopilot? Kung isa ba lang you see yourself doing the same thing over and over again, then nag-automatic na lang. Never do that in terms of innovation planning. So when we want to plan for innovation, never be an autopilot, which means that every step is a conscious step. Ginapanumduman agad. Anong assumption na gina-follow ko? Anong approach ng obrahon ko? Paano ko ni-assess? Assumption, approach, assessment. Liwat-liwaton ta na. Because if we just do routine things without thinking about it critically, we succumb to the autopilot tendency and we just become machines. And we don't want that because we are human beings teaching and mentoring other human beings. That is why when we uh, think in the next couple of years, kay tatlo ang forecast mo, most likely forecast number 2 and forecast number 3 ang muna siyang matabo. Most likely forecast number 3. And we will have to live with disasters and disruptions all the time. And because of that, there's failure is not an option for us. We have to succeed for our learners and for our community. So that's why we have to do bayanihan. And that is why for the new normal, we have to ask, are our teachers and schools ready to think for the new normal? What aspects of the old normal still keeps us from proceeding to the new normal? And if we insist on reaching the remaining goals imposed by the old normal today, despite our condition, paano ta na ubrahon? Kay do kabudlay given our current circumstances. And that is why the conversation continues. And hopefully, this partnership that we have will that we have started now will continue, and we could learn from each other, and we could move forward as a bigger community here in our province. And that is why we have to consider things that were not previously done and ask kung hindi ngayon, kailan. We must never let the new normal happen to us. We must be the one to build the new normal. And the reason for that is that because there is no more normal to come back to. Because the normal that we had before, the old normal, was precisely the problem. That is, this is a graffiti written in Hong Kong right now. And because of that, in behalf of the team, let me be the first to say thank you very much. And we are so happy and glad. I'm so happy and glad to be talking again in Hiligaynon. And thank you very much for your time and for your participation. Hopefully, this is going to be the start of a stronger and more fruitful partnership between our institutions. This is going to be the start of a stronger and more fruitful partnership between our institutions and between as fellow teachers. Madamong salamat. Ma'am Sol?